a 16-year-old obese girl faced the unimaginable horror of execution, her life hanging by a thread as cruel judgment descended upon her. The Mountain Man, a figure shrouded in mystery and wilderness, stepped forward with an act so extraordinary it defied all expectations. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The morning air in the small Tennessee town hung heavy with dread. Carrying the scent of pine and judgment, Mary Johnson stood atop the creaking wooden gallows, her 16-year-old frame trembling despite the warm spring day. Tears carved glistening paths down her round face, dripping onto the rough hemp of her dress. Her wrists, bound tightly with coarse rope, had turned an angry red from her futile struggles. Below, townsfolk gathered in the square, their faces a uniform mask of solemn condemnation. Children clutched at their mothers' skirts, while men removed their hats in somber acknowledgement of what was to come. No one spoke above a whisper, as if volume might betray their complicity in this twisted ritual of justice. For the crime of stealing bread and disrespecting Elder Thompson, announced the town official, his voice cracking slightly, betraying perhaps a hint of doubt. But doubt wasn't enough to stay his hand. Not in this place where tradition and fear ruled with equal measure. Mary's offense had been minor, taking a loaf to feed her ailing grandmother and speaking back when caught, but the town's response was monstrous. They'd made an example of others before her. She would not be the last. The girl's eyes darted desperately across the crowd, searching for a single sympathetic face, finding none brave enough to meet her gaze. The executioner, a thin man with yellowed teeth, fumbled with the noose, his fingers clumsy with either drink or reluctance. The rope swayed ominously in the morning breeze, casting a serpentine shadow across the wooden platform. Then came a shift in the crowd's energy, a ripple of movement and hushed exclamations. At the square's edge, a broad-shouldered figure emerged from between two buildings. John Smith, known throughout the region as the Mountain Man, moved with deliberate steps toward the gallows. His weathered coat, dusted with the distinctive red clay of the hills, marked him as someone who lived beyond the town's reach and perhaps beyond its laws. The whispers intensified. "The Mountain Man," they hissed. "What's he doing here?" Children pointed while adults pulled them back protectively. John was a figure of mystery and unease, respected for his survival skills, feared for his independence from their ways. He moved with quiet purpose through the parting crowd, his face impassive beneath his unkempt beard. No one expected him to interfere in town matters. He rarely ventured from his mountain sanctuary, yet everyone felt the tremor of possibility in the air, the sudden tension of an unwritten script about to veer into unknown territory. Mary's eyes widened as she noticed him approaching. The Mountain Man had never spoken to her before, yet here he was, walking steadily toward her execution as if drawn by some invisible force. For the first time that morning, something besides fear flickered in her heart. Without a word to anyone, John Smith strode forward with deliberate steps, his eyes fixed on Mary as the crowd parted before him in uneasy awe. The townspeople whispered among themselves, some pointing at the Mountain Man's weathered coat dusted with the distinctive red clay of the Tennessee hills. His reputation preceded him, a man who lived by his own rules, far from the judgments of society. The official in charge, a portly man with a face flushed from the morning's excitement, barked a warning. "Stand back, this is town business." But John's steady hand rose in a gesture that silenced him instantly. The Mountain Man reached into his coat and produced a heavy leather pouch, its contents jingling with promise. With calculated precision, he tossed it at the official's feet, where it landed with a substantial thud. The coins spilled partially from the loosened drawstring, glinting in the morning light. "I pay her debt, she goes free." John's deep voice rang out across the square, unyielding as the mountains themselves. His words hung in the air, simple, yet revolutionary. Mary Johnson stared down from the gallows, her round face streaked with tears, unable to comprehend what was happening. The 16-year-old had resigned herself to her fate, convinced that no one would stand for her. Yet here was this broad-shouldered stranger, challenging everyone for her life. The townspeople erupted in protest, their collective outrage swelling like a summer storm. A woman near the front shouted about justice and examples. A bearded man demanded to know what gave the mountain man the right to interfere with their ways. The crowd's anger was palpable. Mary's fate was slipping from their grasp, and with it, their control over who deserved mercy. The official knelt to examine the coins, counting them with greedy fingers. He looked up at John with narrowed eyes, calculating the value against the town's thirst for punishment. The law was clear. Debts could be paid, even those of justice. It was an old custom, rarely invoked, but impossible to deny. For the first time since her arrest, a sliver of hope flickered in Mary's heart. She watched the mountain man stand unmoved by the growing hostility, his posture revealing neither fear nor doubt. Someone had dared to defy them, not with pleas or reasoning, but with an act of direct intervention that no one had anticipated. In that moment, as the official reluctantly nodded his acceptance of the payment, Mary realized that courage could take many forms, and that perhaps her story wasn't ending on the gallows after all. Mary Johnson's legs nearly gave way beneath her, as John Smith's calloused hands worked quickly to free her bound wrists. The rough hemp had left angry red marks that throbbed with each terrified beat of her heart. She stood there, dazed, as if the world had suddenly shifted on its axis. Just moments ago, she had been facing death. Now, this mountain man was guiding her away from the gallows, with a firm but gentle grip on her elbow. "Keep moving," he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Don't look back." The mountain man reached into his weathered pack and pulled out a thick wool cloak, draping it around her trembling shoulders. The warmth enveloped her immediately, a stark contrast to the icy stares that followed their every step. Mary clutched the edges of the fabric, pulling it tighter as if it might shield her not just from the biting Tennessee wind, but from the hatred that radiated from the townsfolk. As they marched across the town square, the wooden boards beneath their feet creaked with each step. The 16-year-old could feel dozens of eyes boring into her back, some filled with anger, others with confusion, and perhaps a few with the faintest hint of relief. The official who had accepted John's payment stood frozen, the pouch of coins still clutched in his hand, as if he couldn't quite believe what had transpired. "Witch!" someone shouted from the crowd. "You can't just buy justice." Another voice joined in. "She'll bring ruin to us all." John's pace never faltered, his broad shoulders squared against the verbal assault as he guided Mary past the last row of onlookers and toward the edge of town. With each step away from the gallows, the shouting grew fainter, replaced by the thunderous pounding of Mary's heart. She could scarcely breathe, her round face flushed with fear and disbelief. "Why?" she finally managed to whisper, her voice cracking. "Why would you help me?" The survivalist didn't answer immediately, his weathered face revealing nothing as they continued their steady pace toward the tree line. Mary studied his profile, trying to understand what would drive this solitary man to defy an entire community for someone like her. "Because no child deserves to die for stealing bread," he finally said, his eyes fixed on the forest ahead. It wasn't mercy or law that had saved her life today. It was this man's raw defiance of injustice. As they left the last buildings behind, Mary felt something unfamiliar stir within her chest. It wasn't gratitude, not exactly. It was the faintest seed of trust, planted in soil that had known only cruelty and shame. They walked in silence, leaving the town behind, as the forest gradually swallowed them. Mary Johnson stumbled occasionally on the uneven terrain, her legs still weak from the ordeal at the gallows. Each time she faltered, John Smith would pause without comment, giving her the moment she needed to regain her footing before continuing onward. The mountain man's pace remained steady, but not hurried, as if he understood exactly how much the 16-year-old could endure. The Tennessee wilderness thickened around them, offering a protective canopy that shielded them from prying eyes. Mary's mind raced with questions she dared not ask. Who was this weathered man who had risked everything to save her? Where was he taking her? Would the townspeople pursue them? Her breath came in shallow bursts, not just from the exertion, but from the lingering terror of her near execution. "We'll rest soon," John said, breaking the hours-long silence. His voice was low and reassuring, like distant thunder without the threat of storm. As dusk painted the forest in deepening shadows, they arrived at a rushing creek. The sound of water tumbling over smooth stones provided a soothing backdrop to their exhaustion. Mary collapsed on a flat boulder, her round face flushed with exertion. "Drink," the mountain man instructed, gesturing toward the clear water. "But cup it with your hands first. Let it settle before you taste it." While Mary quenched her thirst, she noticed John leaning on his walking staff. For the first time, she observed the intricate carvings that spiraled down its length. Tiny symbols, notches, and figures, each one unique and carefully etched into the wood. Some resembled animals, others appeared to be stars or weather patterns. "What are those?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might break whatever spell had saved her life. John ran his weathered fingers over the markings, a rare softness crossing his usually stoic expression. "Each mark is a lesson the mountains taught me," he explained, turning the staff slowly to reveal its full complexity. "This one means beware the sudden thaw. This shows where to find shelter in a lightning storm." He pointed to another symbol. "Out here, wisdom keeps you alive." Mary stared at the staff with newfound fascination, suddenly understanding that it was more than just a walking aid. It was a survival manual, a record of experience carved into wood. "Will I learn these things too?" she ventured, surprising herself with the question. The mountain man studied her for a long moment before nodding once. "If you're willing to listen, the wilderness has much to teach." As the campfire crackled between them, Mary Johnson hung on every word John Smith shared. The mountain man's deep voice rose and fell with the rhythm of his tales, his weathered hands occasionally gesturing. To emphasize a point, he told her about surviving 3 days trapped in a cave during the worst blizzard Tennessee had seen in decades, how he'd learned to make fire from the driest bits of moss and twigs when everything else was soaked through. "The mountains don't forgive mistakes," he explained, stirring the embers with his carved walking staff. "But they reward those who listen and learn." Mary pulled the wool cloak tighter around her shoulders as John described outsmarting a mountain lion by making himself appear larger and backing away slowly, never breaking eye contact with the predator. The teenager's eyes widened when he spoke of finding sustenance in places others would starve. How certain tree bark could be boiled into tea rich with nutrients. How to identify mushrooms that healed rather than poisoned. "Most folks look at these forests and see only danger," he said, his voice carrying quiet pride. "They never learn to see the abundance hiding in plain sight." The girl who had stood trembling on the gallows just days ago found herself leaning forward, absorbing every detail. There was something noble in the way John described his solitary existence. Not as a punishment or exile. The world had always told her she was inadequate, unworthy, taking up too much space. But here, in this vast wilderness, perhaps she could carve out a place where she belonged. The hope that had sparked when John freed her from the gallows now kindled into something warmer, more substantial. As the fire cast dancing shadows across their makeshift camp, Mary realized she wanted more than just to escape death. She wanted to learn how to truly live. The path grew steeper as they climbed higher into the Tennessee mountains. Towering pines closed in around them, their branches forming a natural canopy that filtered the afternoon sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. Mary Johnson's legs burned with each step, muscles unused to such exertion protesting the relentless incline. Her breath came in ragged gasps, but she clenched her teeth and pressed forward, determined not to show weakness. The 16-year-old glanced ahead at John Smith's broad back. The mountain man moved a surprising grace for someone of his size, navigating the uneven terrain with the confidence of someone who knew these woods as intimately as she once knew the streets of her small town. Mary pushed herself harder, refusing to fall behind her unlikely savior. "We'll rest at the ridge," John called back, his deep voice carrying easily through the quiet forest. "Not much farther now." Mary nodded, though he couldn't see her. Sweat trickled down her round face despite the cool mountain air. She focused on placing one foot in front of the other, watching the survivalist's footsteps and trying to match his path through the undergrowth. Her concentration wavered for just a moment as she wiped perspiration from her eyes. In that brief instant, her foot caught on a gnarled root hidden beneath a carpet of fallen leaves. Mary felt herself pitching forward, arms windmilling uselessly as she tumbled to the ground with a startled cry. Sharp pain shot up from her ankle, radiating through her leg with such intensity that tears sprang to her eyes. "Don't move," John commanded, suddenly at her side. His weathered face showed concern as he knelt beside her, his movements quick but gentle. The mountain man's calloused hands carefully examined her ankle, probing with experienced fingers that seemed to know exactly where to touch. "It's not broken," he assessed, "but a bad sprain. You won't be walking on it today." Mary bit her lip, mortified by her clumsiness. "I'm sorry," she whispered, expecting anger or disappointment. Instead, John simply nodded and reached for his pack. "The forest teaches through pain sometimes," he said, pulling out a small bundle of cloth strips. With practiced efficiency, he gathered straight branches from nearby, trimming them with his knife before positioning them around her swollen ankle. The teenager watched in fascination as his strong hands worked methodically, binding the makeshift splint with the cloth strips. Each movement was precise, neither hurried nor wasted. "This will support it until we reach shelter," he explained, tightening the final knot. "The mountains don't forgive weakness, but they reward those who adapt." Mary nodded, understanding that this was another lesson, one about resilience and overcoming obstacles, in her unexpected education of survival. John Smith extended his arm without hesitation, his weathered face betraying no judgment as Mary Johnson grasped it for support. She winced with each step, her injured ankle throbbing beneath the makeshift splint he had crafted. "Lean more of your weight on me," he instructed softly, his voice barely rising above the whisper of wind through the pines. "The path gets steeper ahead." Mary hobbled alongside the mountain man, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. Back in town, clumsiness had always earned her mockery, another reason to be singled out, another flaw to be ridiculed. She waited for the cutting remark that never came. "I'm slowing us down," she finally murmured, eyes fixed on the uneven ground. "They might catch up because of me." John adjusted his grip, supporting her more firmly. "The forest doesn't punish mistakes, girl. It teaches through them." His calloused hand steadied her as she navigated around a jutting rock. "Next time, you'll watch for hidden roots. That's how survival works. Learn or perish." The teenager studied his profile, searching for signs of disappointment or impatience, finding only calm determination. His walking staff, carved with those mysterious symbols, served as both support and guide as they continued their arduous journey through the Tennessee wilderness. As dusk settled over the mountains, John led them beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient pine. The thick canopy offered natural shelter from the elements, and the ground beneath was carpeted with soft needles. Mary sank down gratefully, stretching her injured leg before her. "We'll rest here tonight," he announced, setting down his pack and gathering fallen branches for a small fire. "The smoke will be hidden by the pine boughs." Mary watched as he worked methodically, building a fire pit with stones from the creek bed. arranging kindling in a precise pattern. There was purpose in every movement, an efficiency born from years of mountain solitude. When darkness fell completely, the small fire cast dancing shadows across their makeshift camp. John handed her a strip of dried venison and a water skin, then settled across from her, his broad shoulders resting against the trunk of the pine. "Sleep," he said simply. "I'll keep watch." For the first time since that terrible morning at the gallows, Mary felt the iron grip of fear loosen around her heart. The mountain man's steady presence and unwavering protection created a bubble of safety she hadn't known was possible. As she curled onto her side, the wool cloak wrapped tightly around her trembling form, she realized she was no longer alone in her struggle. Her eyelids grew heavy, the crackling fire and John's vigilant silhouette the last thing she saw before exhaustion claimed her. The crisp mountain air carried a hint of pine as John Smith led Mary deeper into the Tennessee wilderness. The mountain man moved with practiced ease, his weathered face revealing no strain despite the challenging terrain. Mary Johnson followed closely, her round face now showing determination instead of fear. "These purple berries are safe," John explained, cupping a handful of wild fruits. "The red ones beside them will make you sick for days." He placed a few in Mary's palm, watching as she cautiously tasted them. Over the following weeks, their routine became a living classroom. Each morning, the mentor would wake before dawn, already preparing the day's lessons. Mary absorbed everything: how to identify which mushrooms were edible, the proper way to set snares for rabbits, and the art of constructing shelters using nothing but branches and leaves. "Your hands are getting stronger," he noted one afternoon as the teenager successfully bent a flexible sapling to form the frame of a lean-to. Mary couldn't help but smile at the observation. The same hands that had trembled in bonds now created and sustained life. The forest transformed from a bewildering maze into a map she could read with increasing confidence. John taught her to recognize the subtle signs nature provided: how squirrels would gather extra nuts before harsh weather, how certain plants closed their leaves before rain, and how birds would suddenly go silent at approaching danger. "Watch how they scatter," he whispered one morning as a flock of sparrows erupted from a thicket. "Storm's coming. We have maybe 3 hours." Mary nodded, already scanning for suitable shelter locations. She no longer waited for instructions for every decision. By the creek bed, John showed her how to identify deer tracks in the soft mud. "See how fresh these are? The edges haven't dried yet." His student knelt beside him, tracing the outline with her finger, memorizing the pattern. Each lesson built upon the last. Mary learned to move quietly through underbrush, to find north without a compass, to predict weather changes by observing cloud patterns. The knowledge settled into her bones, becoming as natural as breathing. One evening, as they sat beside a small fire, Mary realized something had changed within her. The shame that had clung to her like a shadow was receding. Here, her worth wasn't measured by the cruel judgments of townspeople, but by her growing ability to survive. "You're learning faster than I expected," John admitted, his voice carrying a rare note of pride. Mary stared into the flames, feeling something unfamiliar bloom in her chest. It wasn't just survival skills she was gaining. It was dignity, something the gallows and the condemning eyes of the town had tried to strip away, but couldn't. Not anymore. One crisp morning, Mary Johnson ventured deeper into the forest than she had dared before. The mountain air filled her lungs with a freshness she'd never known in town, where fear had always constricted her breathing. Following the sound of rushing water, she pushed aside a curtain of hanging moss and discovered a hidden spring nestled among smooth rocks, its crystal-clear water catching the sunlight in mesmerizing patterns. The teenager stood transfixed, watching the water bubble up from some mysterious underground source. After weeks in the wilderness, she had learned to appreciate such gifts from nature. This wasn't just beautiful, it was essential. Clean water meant life. "We could use this," she whispered to herself, already formulating a plan. Mary gathered smooth stones from the creek bed, selecting them carefully for size and shape. Her hands, once soft and unused to labor, now moved with purpose as she collected sturdy branches and strips of bark. The girl who had once trembled on the gallows now confidently arranged these materials into layers. First, larger stones, then smaller ones, followed by sand she scooped from the creek's edge, and finally, a layer of charcoal from their previous night's fire. John Smith approached silently, observing her work without interruption. The mountain man leaned on his carved walking staff, his weathered face revealing nothing as Mary tested her creation, pouring murky water through the top and watching as it emerged clearer at the bottom. "The water will stay clean through winter and spring floods this way," she explained, not looking up from her work. "And we can drink without getting sick." When she finally glanced at her mentor, Mary was surprised to see a rare smile breaking through his usually stoic expression. The survivalist nodded slowly, appreciation evident in his eyes. "You're not just surviving, Mary, you're thriving," he said, his deep voice carrying a warmth she'd rarely heard. For the first time since her rescue, pride welled up in Mary's chest. In her old life, her ideas had been dismissed, her voice silenced. Here, under the open sky, her ingenuity was something to be celebrated, not scorned. She had created something useful with her own hands and mind. "I learned from watching you," she admitted, adjusting the final layer of her filter. John shook his head. "No, you watched, yes, but this," he gestured to her creation, "this came from inside you. The mountains didn't break you, they revealed you." Mary smiled, dipping her hands into the filtered water. She was becoming someone new in these hills, someone stronger, someone who could build rather than merely endure. As autumn painted the Tennessee mountains with fiery hues, Mary Johnson found herself transformed by the wilderness. Her body, once soft and unused to labor, had grown lean and strong from months of climbing steep trails and gathering firewood. The girl who had trembled atop the gallows now moved through the forest with quiet confidence, her steps sure even on treacherous ground. "The mountains change with the seasons, and so do we," John Smith had told her one evening as they watched golden leaves spiral down around their cabin. Mary understood this truth now, feeling it in her hardened palms and steadier heartbeat. One crisp morning, they ventured to a small clearing where trappers and travelers occasionally exchanged goods. John needed new fishing line, and Mary had crafted small pouches from rabbit fur that might fetch something useful. The mountain man nodded approvingly at her handiwork before they set out. A handful of rough-looking men gathered around makeshift tables laden with tools, pelts, and preserved foods. Mary stayed close to her mentor, still wary of strangers despite her growing boldness. John traded with practiced ease, his deep voice respectful but firm as he bartered. As Mary displayed her fur pouches to a bearded trader, a thin man with a pockmarked face approached. He stared at her with narrowing eyes, his gaze uncomfortably intense. "Wait," he said, stepping closer. "I know you. Aren't you the girl from the hanging? The one they were fixing to string up back in town." The words hit Mary like ice water. Her throat tightened as memories of the gallows flooded back. The rough rope against her skin, the collective judgment of the townspeople. Fear, so long kept at bay, surged through her veins. John was beside her instantly, his weathered hand steady on her shoulder. "Time to go," he whispered, his voice low but urgent. He gathered their newly acquired supplies with swift efficiency, his eyes never leaving the thin man who continued to stare. "They've been looking for her," the man called out as John guided Mary away from the clearing. "There's talk of—" but they were already moving, John leading her down a narrow path that veered sharply from the main trail. The route was barely visible, marked only by subtle signs that Mary had learned to recognize. A bent sapling, stones arranged in a particular pattern. "This way leads to higher ground," John explained as they climbed. "Few know these paths." Mary's heart pounded, but she matched his pace, grateful for the months of training that allowed her to flee without faltering. The recognition had shaken her, but as they disappeared into the dense forest, following John's secret route, she realized she was no longer helpless. She had become someone who could escape, survive, and protect herself. The mountains had indeed changed her. Mary Johnson and John Smith vanished into the dense Tennessee forest, their footsteps barely audible against the carpet of fallen leaves. The mountain man led with practiced efficiency, choosing paths that left minimal traces while Mary followed closely, mimicking his careful movements. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but she forced herself to focus on John's instructions rather than her fear. "Step where I step," he whispered, his weathered face serious in the dappled light. "The forest can hide us, but only if we respect its ways." They traveled for hours, stopping only when John was certain they'd put enough distance between themselves and the traveler who had recognized Mary. At a small clearing, he finally allowed them to rest. The 16-year-old collapsed against a moss-covered log, her legs trembling from exertion. "That man could tell the townspeople," she said, her voice barely audible. John nodded gravely. "Which is why we must always be prepared." He pulled a small leather pouch from his coat. "I keep emergency provisions hidden throughout these mountains. Food, tools, maps of escape routes." Mary watched as he unfolded a crude map etched on a piece of bark, showing alternative paths through the wilderness. "You've planned for this?" "Freedom requires vigilance," the survivalist explained, tracing a finger along the routes. "Knowledge is your strongest weapon when others seek to cage you." As darkness approached, John taught her how to construct a shelter that blended with the surroundings. Mary's fingers worked nimbly, weaving branches and leaves into a natural hideaway that would be invisible to passing eyes. "The town believes they have power over you because they controlled your fate once," John said as they huddled inside their camouflage shelter. "But out here, you determine your own path." Mary considered his words, remembering the gallows, the hatred in the townspeople's eyes. "They still scare me," she admitted. "Fear is natural," he replied, his voice gentle yet firm. "But fear without action is surrender. Fear with preparation becomes caution." That night, as rain pattered against their shelter, Mary realized something profound. The world hadn't become safer. The threats were still real, but she was becoming stronger, more capable of facing them. Each skill John taught was another shield against those who wished her harm. "Tomorrow," she whispered to herself, "I'll learn more." When morning came, Mary emerged from their shelter with renewed determination. The girl who had once stood trembling on the gallows was gradually disappearing, replaced by someone who could read the forest's secrets and move through it like a shadow. Her trust in John had become something deeper, a faith not just in his protection, but in his vision of what she could become. And with each passing day, her trust in herself grew stronger. Rain drummed steadily on the cabin roof as Mary Johnson wandered through the small mountain dwelling she now called home. With John out checking his traps, she found herself drawn to the unexplored corners of their refuge. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she approached a weathered chest tucked beneath the sloping eaves. Curiosity piqued, she lifted the heavy lid. Inside lay bundles of papers, yellowed with age and tied with simple twine. Mary's fingers trembled slightly as she pulled the first package free, carefully untying the knot that had held these secrets for so long. The first letter was written in delicate script, the handwriting of someone who had learned their letters but used them sparingly. "My name is Sarah," it began. "I was accused of witchcraft when the miller's cow died after I delivered milk." Mary gasped. The girl had escaped hanging by fleeing into these very mountains. Another letter told of Elizabeth, beaten by her father until John had intervened, bringing her to safety. A third spoke of Catherine, whose only crime was rejecting a powerful man's advances. Page after page revealed stories that mirrored her own, young women cast out, condemned, yet somehow surviving. "I learned to set snares today," wrote one. "I can build a fire in the rain," boasted another. "I am no longer afraid of the dark," declared a third. The teenager sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by these testimonies of survival. The cabin suddenly felt different, not just a shelter, but a sanctuary with history. These walls had witnessed transformation before hers. Mary noticed dates scratched at the bottom of some letters. The earliest was from nearly 20 years ago. How long had the mountain man been saving girls like her? How many had passed through this cabin, learning the same lessons of self-reliance she was now mastering? Outside, the rain intensified, but inside, something warm bloomed in Mary's chest. The isolation that had wrapped around her heart since the day at the gallows began to loosen. These letters formed an invisible sisterhood spanning years. Women who had stood where she stood, feared what she feared, and ultimately triumphed. She carefully retied the bundle, placing it back in the chest with reverence. When John returned, soaked from the downpour, he found her sitting by the fire, a new determination in her eyes. "I found the letters," she said simply. He nodded, understanding immediately. "Each story is different, but they all found their strength." "Like me," Mary whispered, not as a question, but as a realization. The weight of uniqueness, of being singularly cursed, had lifted from her shoulders. She was part of something larger, a lineage of survivors who had transformed their pain into power. The crunch of boots on fallen leaves broke the morning stillness. Mary Johnson was gathering herbs near the cabin when she spotted them. 3 men from town trudging up the mountain path, determination etched across their weathered faces. Her stomach knotted as she recognized Sheriff Williams leading the group, his badge catching the sunlight filtering through the trees. "John!" she called softly, backing toward the cabin. The mountain man emerged, his expression hardening as he assessed the approaching threat. "Stay behind me," he murmured, positioning himself between Mary and the visitors. The sheriff removed his hat, revealing thinning gray hair. "We've come for the girl," he announced, voice carrying across the clearing. "The town council's decided she must face proper justice." John Smith stood immovable as stone. "She's paid her debt. I settled it in full view of your entire town." The second man, a deacon from the local church, stepped forward. "It ain't about money anymore. It's about moral order. That girl's presence up here, living with you, it's causing talk. People are questioning our ways." "Good," John replied simply. The third visitor, a merchant Mary recognized from her past life, pointed an accusing finger. "You can't just buy someone's freedom and hide them away. There are rules, procedures." Mary felt something shift inside her, a quiet strength replacing the familiar fear. She stepped out from behind John, standing tall despite her trembling hands. "I'm not hiding," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "And I'm not going back." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Girl, you don't have a choice. You're 16 with no family to speak for you." "I speak for myself now," Mary countered, meeting his gaze. "In town, I was nothing, someone to be punished and forgotten. Here I've learned to survive, to build, to be worth something." The deacon scoffed. "Pretty words from a thief." "I took 1 loaf of bread," Mary said, the memory of hunger sharp in her mind. "And for that you were ready to hang me. What kind of justice is that?" The men exchanged uncomfortable glances. The merchant stepped forward, his tone softening. "Come back with us, Mary. There's talk of leniency now. You could have a normal life." Mary looked around at the forest that had become her sanctuary, at John who had shown her a different path. "This is my life now," she said firmly. "I've tasted freedom and respect. I won't surrender them, not for your comfort, not for your rules." The sheriff's hand moved toward his belt, but John's quiet stance made him reconsider. With muttered threats about returning with more men, The town delegation retreated down the mountain, leaving Mary standing in the clearing, heart pounding but spirit unbroken. The men from town retreated down the mountain path, their grumbling voices fading into the crisp autumn air. Mary Johnson watched them go, her heart still racing but her stance unwavering. She had faced them without flinching, something unimaginable just months ago. "They won't be back anytime soon," John Smith said, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. His eyes, usually guarded and watchful, now shone with unmistakable pride. "You stood your ground like you were born to these mountains." Mary nodded, feeling a strange new confidence settle in her bones. The mountain man had taught her to survive, but this, defending her right to exist freely, was something she'd learned by living it. As the days grew shorter and the first frost painted the forest floor white, Mary's transformation became impossible to ignore. Her hands, once soft and uncertain, now moved with purpose, whether skinning a rabbit or repairing the cabin's roof. She could track deer through dense underbrush, identify which clouds promised snow, and construct shelters that would withstand the mountain's fierce winds. "Watch how the smoke bends," she told John one evening as they sat by the fire. "There's a storm coming from the north." The mentor nodded, saying nothing, but noting how she'd spotted the sign before he had. One morning, as they gathered firewood for the approaching winter, Mary paused beside a massive oak tree. "This is where I fell that first week," she said, touching the spot where she'd sprained her ankle months ago. "I was so afraid you'd leave me behind." John leaned on his carved walking staff, the one covered with notches and symbols. "And now? Now I know a dozen ways to splint a broken bone," she replied with quiet confidence. "And 3 different paths back to the cabin from here." The girl who had stood trembling on the gallows was a faded memory, replaced by someone fiercer and truer. Her round face had grown leaner from mountain living, her eyes sharper and more observant. But the real change lay deeper, in her spirit, in the way she carried herself through the world. That evening, as the first snowflakes began to fall, Mary added another log to the fire and studied the flames. Her old life in town felt like a story someone else had told her, distant and increasingly unreal. Here in the mountains, she had found something she never knew existed, not just survival, but a way of living that honored her strength rather than punishing her for existing. "Winter's coming," John observed, watching her from across the cabin. Mary nodded, unafraid. "Let it come. We're ready." The bitter wind howled through the cracks of the cabin walls, bringing with it a cold that seeped into bones and froze breath into misty clouds. Mary Johnson had survived the gallows and learned to thrive in the wilderness, but nature had its own harsh justice. As winter tightened its grip on the Tennessee mountains, the 16-year-old's body began to surrender to an invisible enemy. It started with a shiver she couldn't control, then a cough that rattled her chest. By nightfall, Mary lay on her simple bed of pine boughs, her round face flushed with fever, her strength evaporating with each labored breath. John found her delirious, mumbling about the town square and the noose that had nearly claimed her life months before. "Am I dying after all?" she whispered, her voice cracking with fear. "Did they just give me a longer rope?" The mountain man's weathered face betrayed no panic, though concern shadowed his eyes. He placed his calloused hand on her forehead, feeling the dangerous heat radiating from her skin. Without a word, he gathered his knowledge of the forest's medicine cabinet and went to work. John ventured into the snow-covered forest, returning with armfuls of pine needles, willow bark, and the last of the echinacea that clung stubbornly to life beneath the frost. He brewed bitter teas that made Mary grimace, but she trusted him enough to drink every drop. The cabin filled with the pungent aroma of healing herbs as he worked tirelessly, stoking the fire until sweat beaded on his brow despite the cold. Through fevered dreams, Mary felt his presence, a cool cloth on her forehead, strong arms lifting her to drink, a steady voice anchoring her to the world when delirium threatened to sweep her away. In her most lucid moments, she recognized something she'd never seen before: fear in her mentor's eyes, not for himself, but for her. Days blurred together. The blizzard outside matched the storm raging within her body. John never left her side except to gather more wood or herbs, sleeping in short bursts on the floor beside her bed. He told her stories of others who had survived worse, his deep voice a lifeline she clung to when the fever peaked. "Fight, Mary," he urged when her breathing grew shallow. "You didn't escape that noose to let winter take you." Something in his words kindled a spark within her. The same determination that had helped her learn to hunt and build now turned inward, battling against the illness. Their shared struggle became a testament to the bond they'd formed. Not just teacher and student, but two survivors united against all that would destroy them. As the worst night of her fever broke, Mary realized that survival wasn't just about skill. Sometimes it was about having someone who refused to let you slip away. The fever broke on the 7th day. Mary Johnson's eyes fluttered open to find sunlight streaming through the cabin's small window, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. Her body felt hollow, wrung out like wet laundry, but the burning heat that had consumed her was finally gone. "You're back," John said simply, his weathered face showing the toll of sleepless nights. The mountain man had barely left her side during the worst of it, changing damp cloths on her forehead and coaxing bitter herbal teas between her cracked lips. Mary tried to sit up, but found her arms trembling with the effort. "How long was I?" "Nearly a week," he replied, helping her to a sitting position and offering a cup of pine needle tea. "The mountain winters claim many who aren't prepared. You fought hard." She sipped the astringent liquid, grimacing at its taste but appreciating its warmth. During her delirium, she'd heard John's voice, sometimes telling stories of survival, sometimes simply reassuring her that she wasn't alone. Those words had been an anchor in the storm of her fever. "I thought I might die," she whispered. John nodded solemnly. "The body speaks its own language. You need to learn to listen to it. Hunger, thirst, pain, exhaustion, they're all messages." Over the following days, her mentor taught her to recognize her limits. When she tried to resume her chores too quickly and grew dizzy, he showed her how to breathe deeply and rest without shame. When her appetite returned, he prepared nourishing broths from dried venison and wild roots, explaining how different foods could strengthen different parts of the body. "The town doctor would have bled me, wouldn't he?" Mary asked one evening as they sat before the fire. John's eyes darkened. "Likely, and you might not have survived it." The realization that her illness might have been a death sentence in her old life wasn't lost on her. Here in this simple cabin, she'd received something the town had never offered: genuine care without judgment. As her strength returned, Mary noticed a shift in their relationship. John no longer treated her as merely a student to be instructed, but as someone who had endured a trial alongside him. He shared stories from his own past, times when illness or injury had nearly claimed him, and how each recovery had taught him something valuable. By the time she could walk the full perimeter of the cabin without resting, Mary felt different, not just physically, but in her spirit. The illness had stripped away another layer of her old self, revealing someone stronger and more determined beneath. She had faced death again, and once more, she had survived. "I'm ready to continue learning," she told John one morning, standing tall despite her still thin frame. He studied her for a moment, then nodded with quiet approval. "I believe you are." Word of Mary Johnson's survival had begun to make its way down from the mountains, carried by travelers and traders who passed through the Tennessee town. At first, it was merely whispers, stories of the girl who should have died, but now lived free among the peaks. The tales grew with each telling, some claiming she had become as wild as the forest itself, others insisting she possessed wisdom beyond her years. In the town square where her gallows once stood, opinions divided sharply. "She's learned more about living in those mountains than we could teach her in a lifetime," admitted the blacksmith, who had once stood silent at her sentencing. His words found agreement among some, particularly the younger folk who secretly admired her escape from their stifling community. Others, especially those who had been loudest in demanding her punishment, couldn't bear the thought of her thriving. "That girl made a mockery of our justice," the town official grumbled, the same man who had once pocketed John's coins. His fingers still twisted the gold piece he kept as a reminder of his humiliation. "She should be grateful we haven't sent men to bring her back." When Mary heard these reports from a friendly trader who occasionally brought supplies to their cabin, she sat quietly by the fire, absorbing the knowledge that her name still lived in the valley below. The 16-year-old touched the rough calluses on her once soft hands, physical proof of her transformation. "They're still talking about me," she told John as he returned from checking his traps, "not as someone to pity or punish, but as someone who survived." The mountain man nodded, his weathered face thoughtful in the firelight. "Words travel farther than people realize. Your story has power now." For the first time, Mary understood that what had happened to her mattered beyond her own survival. Each person who heard about the girl who escaped the gallows and learned to live in the wilderness carried a seed of possibility with them. Her journey from condemned prisoner to self-sufficient survivor challenged everything the townspeople believed about justice, strength, and who deserved a second chance. "I never wanted to be important," she said, watching sparks rise from the hearth. "I just wanted to live." "That's exactly why your story matters," John replied. "You fought for something everyone deserves, but few truly claim, the right to determine your own fate." Mary nodded slowly, realizing that surviving wasn't just about staying alive. It was about reclaiming her voice, her dignity, and her future from those who had tried to take them away. Her story was no longer one of shame, but had transformed into something powerful, a beacon of hope that might light the way for others trapped in darkness. As spring arrived, Mary Johnson stood at the edge of a limestone cliff, gazing out over the endless expanse of green that blanketed the Tennessee mountains. The morning breeze lifted her hair, stronger now than the thin, frightened strands that had framed her face on that terrible day at the gallows. She inhaled deeply, filling her lungs with the scent of pine and wildflowers, a world away from the suffocating fear that had once been her constant companion. Below, a young deer picked its way through the underbrush. Mary tracked its movement with practiced eyes, noting how it paused to test the air, just as she had learned to do. She could now identify which plants would heal a fever, which mushrooms were safe to eat, and how to find water in seemingly barren terrain. These skills, once as foreign to her as flying, had become second nature. "You're quiet today," John said, approaching with his carved walking staff in hand. "Just thinking," she replied, not turning from the view. "A year ago, I couldn't have imagined standing here. I couldn't have imagined surviving at all." The mountain man nodded, understanding in his weathered face. He had seen her transformation day by day, the trembling girl becoming a young woman who could set snares, build shelters, and face down threats without flinching. "The town sent another messenger yesterday," he said after a moment. Mary's shoulders tensed slightly, but she didn't show the panic such news would have once triggered. "What did they want this time?" "To see if the stories were true, that you've become something of a legend among the younger folk." A small smile tugged at her lips. "A legend? Me? The girl who escaped the gallows and learned to thrive in the wilderness. Some say you've become as wild and untamable as the mountains themselves." Mary considered this, watching an eagle circle overhead. She had claimed her own narrative, transforming from a victim of cruelty into something else entirely. Not just a survivor, but a symbol of possibility. "The world is still dangerous," she said, picking up a smooth stone and turning it over in her palm. "But now I face it on my own terms." John nodded, pride evident in his quiet gaze. The girl who had once cowered at every shadow now stood tall against the sky, her silhouette strong against the vast wilderness that had become her home and her teacher. "That," he said simply, "is the greatest skill of all." Mary tossed the stone over the edge, watching it fall until it disappeared among the trees below, just as she had let her old fears drop away, one by one, replaced by the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered her own strength. John Smith stood at the edge of the clearing, watching as Mary moved with practiced ease through the forest. The mountain man's weathered face softened with pride as she expertly identified edible mushrooms, her movements now confident and deliberate. It had been nearly a year since he'd pulled her from the gallows, and the transformation was remarkable. "You don't need me showing you the way anymore," he said quietly as she approached with her gathered bounty. Mary Johnson smiled, the fear that once dominated her round face now replaced with quiet determination. "I still have more to learn," she replied, though they both knew she had mastered survival in ways neither could have imagined on that fateful day in the Tennessee town square. The mentor studied his pupil thoughtfully. The trembling, terrified girl was gone. In her place stood a young woman who could track deer, build shelters, and navigate the wilderness with instinctive skill. More importantly, she had found her voice and her courage. "The mountains have shaped you," he observed, gesturing toward the vast expanse of forest surrounding their cabin. "They've given you what that town tried to take away." Mary nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in his words. The wilderness had been unforgiving but honest. Unlike the cruelty of the townspeople, the mountains demanded respect rather than submission. "I used to dream about them coming to find me," she confessed, arranging her foraged items carefully. "I'd wake up hearing the gallows creaking." John rested his hand on his walking staff, the carved notches catching the afternoon light. "And now? Now I know I could face them," she said simply. The statement held no bravado, just quiet certainty. Their bond had been forged through bitter winters, through illness and hunger, through moments of danger and discovery. It was built on the foundation of that single defiant act, when he had tossed a pouch of coins at the official's feet and claimed her freedom, but had grown into something profound and unbreakable. As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the clearing, John realized his role had fundamentally changed. He was no longer simply a protector or teacher. Mary had become his equal in many ways, a partner in survival, a testament to resilience. "You're not just surviving anymore," he said, echoing words he had spoken months before. "You've become something they could never understand." Mary looked up at him, her eyes clear and steady. She was no longer the frightened girl on the gallows. She was a survivor, a leader, and a force of nature. The mountains had claimed her, transformed her, and set her free. 1 year had passed since that fateful day at the gallows. Mary Johnson made her way through the familiar forest path, each step confident where once she had stumbled. The hidden spring welcomed her with its gentle burble, sunlight dancing across the water's surface through the canopy above. This place had become sacred to her, a symbol of her rebirth. She knelt beside the crystal waters, running her fingers through the cool stream. The crude filter she had built months ago still stood, improved now with careful stonework that ensured clean water through every season. Mary smiled at this small monument to her ingenuity. From her pocket, she withdrew John's walking staff. The mountain man had presented it to her that morning with a nod that conveyed more than words ever could. "It's time you added your own mark," he had said, his weathered face crinkling with rare emotion. Mary traced her fingers over the intricate carvings that spiraled down the wood, each notch representing a lesson learned, a hardship overcome. With the small knife John had taught her to sharpen and maintain, she carefully began to carve her own symbol into the staff. Not merely a mark of survival, but of transformation. Each cut is a memory, she whispered to herself, thinking of her trembling legs atop the gallows, the cold stares of the townspeople, the weight of shame they had tried to hang around her neck. She carved deeper, remembering the first rabbit she had snared, the fever she had survived, the men from town she had faced down with unwavering resolve. The teenager worked until her symbol was complete, a small spring surrounded by protective stones. Unlike the other marks that spoke of danger overcome, hers celebrated creation and protection, something built rather than endured. As the sun began its descent behind the Tennessee mountains, casting long shadows through the trees, Mary stood and held the staff before her. She was no longer the round-faced, frightened girl who had been moments from death. Her body had grown strong from mountain living, her spirit unbreakable. "I will never be powerless again," she promised the fading light. Her voice steady and sure where once it had quavered with fear. The journey back to the cabin was peaceful. John would be waiting, ready to share the evening meal she had helped prepare. Their bond, forged in defiance and strengthened through shared hardship, had given her not just survival skills, but something far more precious, the knowledge that she was worthy of fighting for. Mary Johnson's story had begun in terror on those gallows, but as she walked the mountain path home, she knew with absolute certainty that it would end in triumph. Her destiny was forever her own.